So, if you follow any sports at all, you've probably heard of the Canadian Football League or at least Canadian football. And if you haven't, well, consider this your introduction to the sport and the league. For most Americans that like football, it's basically a league where old NFL players that didn't make it in the league try to continue their career, or if you're Johnny Manziel, it's another excuse to get blacklisted somewhere. But I'm sure even the biggest fans of either the NFL or the CFL probably don't know that teams from both leagues have actually played each other multiple times. And while it was a very short-lived endeavor, the fact that there were exactly 5 games between NFL teams and CFL teams is actually pretty surprising. So for today's topic, I'm first going to tell you a little bit about Canadian football because most of you are probably not that familiar with it, and some of the information about it's going to come in handy for this video. And then after that, I'll dive into the main topic, the awkward history of the NFL-CFL Interleague Series. All right, let's get started. Wait, I almost forgot. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe down below. So if you already know a bit about Canadian football or you just want to get straight to the main topic, just skip to this time. Canadian football is just a variation of gridiron football that's actually very similar to American football. If you don't know what gridiron football is, it's basically football where the field looks like this. It has hash marks, yard lines, it's a big box with grass on it, and the ball looks like this. It's a very similar sport, just it comes down to different number of people and the lines drawn on it, etc. But these differences are significant ones, and it's what helps Canadian football stand out from its American counterparts. For starters, Canadian football has 12 players on each side instead of the 11 that they have in American football. A lot of this has to do with the fact that in Canadian football, the field is actually larger than in American football. So as you probably know, an American football field is 100 yards long, and you might know it's 53 1/3 yards wide. In Canadian football, the field is 110 yards long and 65 yards wide. Makes sense to have an extra person out there. Why are these dimensions different? They just are. Different people make different rules and make different decisions on things. Not everything really has an interesting explanation in life. I saw this one take on YouTube that said it had to do with the length of what it equates to in meters, and that's just very false. I only thought of this one scene in the movie when I read that, actually.
You're not just wrong, you're stupid.
Because, I mean, it isn't just wrong, it is actually stupid. Anyway, back to telling you other rules. So Canadian football has 3 downs instead of 4 downs like in American football. Canadian football doesn't have a fair catch rule like in American football, and instead defenders must allow enough space for the receiver to get the ball or face a penalty. Canadian football also has a scoring system that allows for a single point outside of a touchdown, so in theory the lowest score can be 1-0 versus in American football where it can be 2-0. Okay, so those are all the important differences between American football and Canadian football. Hopefully that helps clarify some things and prevents any confusion from anything I say later on when I talk about the games. So now you know all these rules, let's get into the awkward history of these NFL-CFL games. So our story begins in 1959 when the Toronto Argonauts hosted the Chicago Cardinals up in Toronto. This game used a mix of NFL and CFL rules, which is why I wanted to clarify them earlier in the video. In the game, there was a Canadian-sized field of 110 yards, but they only used 11 players like in the NFL. The rules of the game opted for NFL-style downfield blocking, but they went with Canadian kicking rules, so no fair catch. This mix of rules kind of made sure that no one had a disadvantage, at least from knowing the rules standpoint. But when it comes to, better players and talent and size, that's a different story. The Argos would get off to a 13-1 start in this game, but this lead would be short-lived. Turns out Cardinals head coach Pop Ivy had been a head coach in the CFL, and he knew a thing or two about the Canadian rules, which means his team knew more about both rules than the Argos knew about both. As a result, the Cardinals just also being just bigger and faster were able to steamroll the Argos and win the game 55-26. And while the Argos got beaten pretty badly, they had a really good showing at the gate, almost 28,000 people, which for Canadian football is pretty good, and they decided to host 2 more games against NFL teams. So it seems you guys got pretty beat up there. Yeah, we got pretty beaten up, but there's always next year. So what you're saying is you're going to do this again? Yeah, I mean, people really enjoyed it, so we're going to do this about 2 more times. So the Argos played 2 more games against NFL teams. In 1960, they tried the Pittsburgh Steelers, and then in 1961, they go up against the Cardinals again. Except this time they're the St. Louis Cardinals. Not to be confused with these St. Louis Cardinals, but they do play the St. Louis Cardinals. Each game would be lower scoring than the one before, but that doesn't mean the Argonauts were any closer to winning the game. As a matter of fact, they were still getting blown out each time. The Steelers annihilated the Argonauts by a final score of 43-16, while the Cardinals committed murder by a final score of 36-7. And again, people liked coming to these games. About 23,000 to 24,000 for both of them, but I guess after that the Argos realized this is not worth it. We're getting killed out there, let's not do this again. Either that or no one else wanted to play them. There's no information on this. I'm just speculating. This is slowly becoming an equivalent in pro football to an FCS team asking like a top 25 team like Florida or Bama to annihilate them for money. But while the Argos are done, 6 hours east in Montreal, the Alouettes were looking to get on the NFL game action. Just a few days after the matchup between the Argos and the Cardinals for a second time, the Montreal Alouettes played a game against the Chicago Bears in Montreal. This setup was a little bit different than the 3 games in Toronto. In the first half, they played by Canadian rules. In the second half, they played by NFL rules. And you can see how this can get bad really quickly. In the first half, played by Canadian rules, the Montreal Alouettes actually led the Chicago Bears by a score of 9-7. So even when they had the rules advantage, they weren't good enough to really get any real lead. But a lead's a lead. However, in the second half, when it was NFL rules, Chicago broke that one wide open. They outscored the Alouettes by 27-7 to win 34-16. I guess in a way, it's still a victory for Montreal that was the final score. Their head coach did expect them to lose by a much larger margin, more like 50 or 80-0. And yes, the head coach did actually say that. So Toronto and Montreal have both tried this really terrible idea. However, there was one more Canadian football team that got in on the mix, and this time they planned it out in a way that actually gave them a shot to win. Okay, just to establish the obvious visual change, I'm wearing a jersey now. So the last Canadian football team to get in on this stunt was the Hamilton Tiger Cats. Instead of playing a traditional NFL team, they challenged the upstart AFL to a game. And of course, the AFL does count because it's part of NFL history, and if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have the Super Bowl or these teams. There's no details on the whole challenge accepted part, but I can only assume that the AFL's logic was, hey, if the NFL is doing this, then so can we. So the Tiger Cats will be matched up with their cross-border rival, the Buffalo Bills. Buffalo actually kind of makes sense as a pick because they're only 70 miles from Hamilton. Why send any other team when you have one right there? And while the geographical logic makes sense, the choice in who representing the AFL would completely backfire. The Tiger Cats would beat the Bills 38-21, giving Canada their first victory in the series. After the Bills lost to the Tiger Cats, the AFL was so embarrassed about it that they decided to never do another international game again. And I get this loss sucked a lot, but you sent one of the worst teams in your league. And I know this is some Bills joke, insert here, this is why we can't have nice things, but they were last place in their division the year before. I get it, they're right there 70 miles from Hamilton, but why not send the Houston Oilers who just won the AFL championship the year before? It's not a guarantee you win either, but at least you have a higher chance of doing so. You know what, I'm just going to accept you asked for this, and have a nice day, AFL. But that'll do it. That'll do it for this episode of Awkward Sports History. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe down below, and I'll see you next time.